Imagine a scenario. A hopeful individual attends an event seeking new connections, only to encounter an unexpected figure. Donald Trump appears, introduces himself without bothering to remember anyone's names, and confidently declares, "Someday you'll be able to sit there with the rich people." Before departing, Mark Cuban, the renowned businessman, doesn't just discuss profitable deals. He openly criticizes questionable ventures, particularly when it comes to Donald Trump's trade policies. Cuban is convinced that Trump's obsessive focus on tariffs is not only reckless but also a serious threat. In his view, imposing tariffs on countries based solely on personal animosity is short-sighted and economically destructive, capable of harming American businesses. It's important to remember that tariffs aren't a burden on foreign governments. They're taxes that fall on the shoulders of American companies and consumers. Mark Cuban expresses serious doubts about Donald Trump's understanding or his indifference to the economic consequences of trade tariffs. According to Cuban, tariffs that increase the cost of imported materials will inevitably lead to either higher consumer prices or business bankruptcies. But that's only part of the problem. Countries facing American tariffs won't stand idly by. They'll respond with mirroring measures, creating serious obstacles for American companies seeking to sell their products abroad. Cuban, commenting on Trump's statements, used the word insane, explaining that strategic tariffs might be justified in cases where foreign companies are engaged in dumping on the American market. However, blanket tariffs of 10 to 20% are, in essence, an inflationary tax that burdens American consumers. Of particular concern to Cuban is the situation where a legendary company like John Deere is threatened with a 200% tariff if it decides to move production. At the same time, tariffs on Chinese competitors remain at 10 to 20%. In Cuban's opinion, this creates favorable conditions for Chinese companies, allowing them to take business away from John Deere, which he calls utter madness. For Mark Cuban, the Trump administration's actions aren't just a misguided political line. They're outright economic sabotage. He characterizes Trump's leadership style as the embodiment of the worst business practices, where personal antipathies and grudges become the determining factors in decision-making at the national level. In Cuban's view, these actions aren't driven by a desire to strengthen America but by Trump's inflated ego, which represents an unwarranted risk that the country simply can't afford. It's worth noting that Cuban's criticism isn't limited to this area. His disagreement with Trump's policies runs deeper, especially when it comes to issues of honesty and integrity. Mark Cuban openly opposes what he considers to be flawed political decisions, and in particular, he sharply criticizes Donald Trump's tariff policy, calling it nothing short of reckless. Cuban is convinced that imposing tariffs on certain countries based solely on Trump's personal political disagreements with their leaders is nothing more than a manifestation of impulsiveness, fraught with serious economic consequences. He emphasizes that these tariffs lack any strategic direction and represent ill-considered, reactionary measures that ignore the real mechanisms of global trade. The problem is this: tariffs, in essence, represent a form of taxation on imported goods, and these costs don't vanish into thin air. They're passed on to American businesses and, ultimately, to consumers. This leads to higher prices on a wide range of goods, from cars to electronics and food. Mark Cuban rightly points out that such a situation becomes a real disaster for small businesses, which vitally depend on affordable imports to maintain competitiveness. He warns that such a policy doesn't just strike a blow against foreign manufacturers. It punishes American companies whose operations are closely linked to global supply chains. The very idea of taxing literally all goods simply because someone doesn't like the manufacturers from a particular country seems absurd. After all, it's the same sales tax that Com was talking about. But it's not just about levying a tax on the imported product. An additional tax burden arises for companies forced to engage in administrative procedures, fill out customs declarations, or hire brokers for accounting. All these factors, especially for small businesses, turn not only into a tariff on the consumer of products but also into a tax on the company itself, which is forced to implement these measures. Even large corporations are not immune to these costs. The moment of reckoning inevitably arrives. States that have felt the impact of American tariffs will not silently observe what is happening. They will respond with mirror measures, imposing their own tariffs on American goods. This will lead to farmers, industrial enterprises, and entire export-oriented industries facing the closure of key sales markets. As Mark Cuban notes, such trade conflicts rarely yield positive results, and history demonstrates their counterproductivity. Paradoxically, tariffs designed to protect the American economy actually harm it. By increasing the cost of doing business, they stifle economic growth, lead to job losses, and ultimately weaken the country. According to Cuban, this policy is not only mistaken but also demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of the principles of how the modern economy functions. Nevertheless, Donald Trump continues to stubbornly adhere to this strategy, convinced that economic warfare is the path to America's prosperity. Cuban strongly disagrees with this viewpoint, and he is not alone in his beliefs. Throughout his career, Mark Cuban has made many successful deals, but when speaking about Donald Trump, he emphasizes that he is the most unethical person he has ever had to deal with in business. Mark Cuban has repeatedly stated, based on personal experience, that Donald Trump is completely dishonest in his actions. According to Cuban, Trump is the most unethical and dishonest person he has ever had to do business with. Cuban is convinced that character is crucial, especially when it comes to the presidency. No one can predict what challenges a country's leader will face, whether large-scale crises or minor problems. That's why it's so important for the president to have qualities such as empathy, a willingness to learn and understand, and ethics when making difficult decisions. Cuban doesn't understand how people can support Donald Trump, given his shortcomings in character and ethics. He fears that in difficult times, Trump will only listen to himself, and the consequences of this are already known. Mark Cuban, a well-known entrepreneur and media mogul, has repeatedly recalled his experience interacting with Donald Trump, and, according to him, dishonesty was a constant theme of these meetings. Whether it was questionable business maneuvers, broken promises, or outright lies, Trump, as Cuban notes, always seemed more interested in manipulating the situation to his advantage than in making an honest and mutually beneficial deal. Unlike most entrepreneurs who strive for long-term trust and authority, Trump, according to Cuban, prefers to play a short game where only he wins and everyone else loses. And this is not just personal disappointment or resentment. This experience shaped Cuban's entire position regarding Trump as a leader. Cuban asks, if a person is willing to be dishonest in business, why should we expect him to be honest in politics? He sees a direct connection between Trump's business deals and his time as president, arguing that the same self-serving and deceitful tactics are now being used to govern an entire country. Cuban cites an example from personal experience when Trump first invited him to a meeting and then, a couple of weeks later, called back with apologies, offering to make up for lost time. This episode, according to Cuban, only confirms his belief in Trump's inconsistency and unreliability. Imagine the situation. A visitor enters an office, expecting to see a standard set of photographs. Happy faces of children, family moments, maybe a couple of snapshots of the office owner. But instead, he is faced with a wall completely covered with images of the same person. There he is, and here he is, as if in a mirror gallery of self-admiration. This is the picture that Mark Cuban, a well-known entrepreneur and media mogul, captured in his memory after visiting Donald Trump's office. Cuban, not mincing words, lashed out at the future president, calling him an unethical businessman whose empire, in his opinion, was built on deception and self-promotion, not on real achievements. These statements caused a storm of indignation and support. Trump's supporters accused Cuban of personal animosity and envy, while Trump's opponents saw in the billionaire's words another confirmation of his dubious reputation. For Cuban, everything was crystal clear. Character matters, and Trump's track record in business and politics, in his opinion, testified to a lack of moral principles. Cuban also drew attention to the differences in immigration policies between the Obama and Trump administrations. He noted that, contrary to popular belief, the Obama administration deported more immigrants than the Trump administration, which challenges the image of Trump as an uncompromising fighter against illegal immigration. In 2012, the Obama administration deported approximately 410,000 people, a record that the Trump administration never surpassed in any subsequent year. Obama's approach was characterized by strict adherence to legal norms and procedures, with an emphasis on deporting those who posed a real threat to national or public safety. This method ensured compliance with all legal formalities, maintaining the integrity of the legal system. In contrast, Trump's rhetoric, which often called for immediate expulsion, drew criticism. His statements implied a willingness to use executive power to circumvent established legal processes, seeking rapid deportation without adhering to ordinary legal procedures. Experts believe that such an approach not only undermines the rule of law but also creates risks to social stability by ignoring legal norms. There is a danger of undermining public confidence in government institutions and creating a dangerous precedent where the executive branch can arbitrarily overturn established legal frameworks. During the election debates, it became clear that the candidate was not inclined to listen to others' opinions. And now, in an attempt to convince voters to give him their votes, he again evades a direct answer as to whether he has a clear plan of action. He talks about concepts, about the fact that he does not currently hold the presidential post. When dozens of members of his own cabinet publicly declare their disagreement and urge people not to vote for him, when former Republican presidents and sitting senators openly warn against his election, it is difficult to ignore these signals. It sounds unacceptable when President Trump asserts that someone should disregard their oath to support and defend the Constitution. This speaks to a lack of moral principles. People would be willing to grant him the presumption of innocence if they believed in his ethical standards, his character, or at least his honesty. But this is not happening, and that speaks volumes. Such a person cannot be trusted to manage the country in times of uncertainty. And just as serious a problem as the lack of ethics, character, and honesty is his unwillingness to learn and grow. A figure is emerging on the political stage whose actions and statements raise more and more questions every day. It seems that with each passing day, his intellectual baggage becomes lighter, and observers can hardly recall a moment when he demonstrated a deep understanding or strategic thinking. Mark Cuban, a well-known entrepreneur and investor, draws attention to the fundamental difference between the approaches to problem-solving in the Obama administration and the Trump administration. While the former emphasized compliance with legality and procedural norms, the latter, according to Cuban, prioritizes expediency, which can have negative consequences for the legal system and public trust. Cuban does not hide his concern about the potential risks posed by Donald Trump's policies, especially in the economic sphere and in matters relating to moral qualities. He is particularly concerned about the long-term consequences of trade wars and the imposition of tariffs, which he believes could lead to increased costs for American consumers and businesses. Mark Cuban has criticized Donald Trump's idea of imposing 200% tariffs on John Deere products if production is moved to Mexico. According to the entrepreneur, such a measure borders on madness and could undermine the position of the legendary American brand, while at the same time driving up prices for ordinary consumers. He warns that such protectionist policies are fraught not only with rising prices but also with retaliatory economic measures from other countries. Cuban expressed concern about Trump's plans to impose a 60% tariff on all goods imported from China, calling the idea absurd. He emphasized that such a proposal demonstrates Trump's complete misunderstanding of how the tariff system works, as he apparently believes that the tariffs are paid by the Chinese side. Cuban recalled that Trump had previously made a naive suggestion that the construction of a wall on the border with Mexico would be paid for by the Mexican government. The entrepreneur noted that in the 1990s and early 2000s, Trump demonstrated a more sensible approach to trade policy issues, but his views have undergone significant changes in recent years. Cuban expressed regret that Trump's current views on tariffs and trade lack logic and consistency, turning into a disjointed collection of ideas. Mark Cuban points out that even small companies will feel the burden of complying with new tariff requirements, which require significant time and financial costs. He previously expressed the opinion that such blanket tariffs fuel inflation and could provoke retaliatory economic measures from other countries. Cuban's criticism echoes a broad discussion among business leaders and economists regarding the advisability of using tariffs as an instrument of economic policy. Many experts argue that, despite the stated goal of protecting domestic industry, tariffs often lead to higher prices for consumers and can trigger retaliation from trading partners, which could unleash a global trade war. However, Cuban's concern is not limited to economic aspects. It also touches on Donald Trump's leadership style. He shares the opinion of actor Robert De Niro, who described Trump as a gangster operating outside the law. De Niro did not mince words, stating that Trump behaves like a gangster and thinks in terms of the criminal world. Mark Cuban shares concerns about the potential consequences of such policies, pointing to the threat to democratic values and the rule of law. In his opinion, true leadership should be based on ethical standards and respect for existing institutions. A departure from these principles, Cuban believes, carries serious risks for the stability of society. The businessman expresses disagreement with those who, in his opinion, are mistaken about the true nature of what is happening. He emphasizes that he will never abandon his beliefs and calls on those who turn a blind eye to the obvious to feel ashamed. Drawing a parallel between the Trump family and gangsters, Cuban argues that such a comparison is quite appropriate, since Donald Trump's actions and way of thinking resemble gangster methods. At the same time, he notes that even in the criminal world there are concepts of honor and justice. Decency, the ability to keep one's word, and honest treatment of people are valued regardless of the type of activity. Cuban perceives Trump's political course as economically and ethically risky, capable of entailing long-term negative consequences for the American economy and democratic foundations. Billionaire Mark Cuban does not shy away from assessing Donald Trump's political course, calling it nothing less than reckless. According to Cuban, the actions of the Trump administration, from the introduction of trade tariffs to deportation policies, pose a threat to the American economy and democratic institutions. Cuban warns against making impulsive decisions dictated by momentary considerations, without a clear strategy and long-term vision. He is convinced that such steps could have serious negative consequences in the future. Do you share Mark Cuban's concerns? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you are interested in this topic, like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new releases. More interesting videos can be found on the screen.